Alright, so here's part 2 of our series on poverty in the U.S. Remember, part 1 looked at the history of poverty in the U.S. And again, of course, while there's always been poor people in the United States, how we've thought about poverty and then, of course, how we've tried to deal with poverty has changed significantly. The second part is really about how do we measure poverty? How do we know how many poor people there are in the U.S.? And of course, the most obvious way is the sort of official U.S. poverty line. And I wanted to look at what that is today. So let's check that out. How much money do you not need to make in order to be considered poor? So here we have a link. I put this on Canvas if you want to check it out. But here's the current numbers, right, for 2017 poverty guidelines. So for a family of one, a single person, if you're making anything less than $12,060 a year, you're officially considered poor. Right, I'm always interested in a family of 4. Anything less than $24,600, you're officially considered poor. They do have a little bit different guidelines for Alaska and Hawaii. The numbers are a little bit not higher, not significantly, but a little bit higher. So that's the official poverty line, right? And let's look at a little video on how did we come up with that number. And as we watch this little video, I want you to be thinking about not only how did we come up with the way to measure poverty, but maybe jot down some ideas on the problems with our official poverty line. So let's watch this and then we'll come back.
How poverty is measured in the United States. Here are two families living in the United States. They have similar incomes. However, one family is considered in poverty and the other is not. How could that be? Who decides who's poor in the United States? How is poverty measured? The answer takes us back 50 years. A boom economy after World War II brought tremendous prosperity to the country. But millions were left out. When President Johnson launched the War on Poverty in 1964, the Census Bureau needed an accurate way to determine who was in poverty and whether we were winning the battle to end it. But there was no official method. Enter Molly Orshansky, a government statistician who developed a simple way to measure poverty. In the early 60s, the average family spent about 1/3 of their income on food. So Orshansky calculated the cost of feeding that family using the cheapest government food plan. Then she did some simple math. Since the Census Bureau needed a yardstick, Orshansky's method was pressed into service as the official poverty measure. Its shortcomings, however, were stark. Not only was the food plan unrealistic for daily life, the measure was absolute. A family that earned even 1 penny more would not be considered poor. More limitations soon emerged. Life is more or less expensive, depending on where you live. The measure doesn't take this into account. Today, food is a lot cheaper, but other necessities cost more, like transportation, healthcare, and childcare. In its simplicity, the poverty measure both overstates and understates the realities of poverty. It overstates poverty by not counting benefits, like food stamps, subsidized housing, and childcare. It understates poverty by ignoring expenses, like transportation, healthcare, and rent, that take a huge bite out of family income. Without an accurate way to count people and families in need, we don't know who's poor in the United States. And this impacts policy, programs, and people. When it comes to measuring poverty, how we count really does count.
Okay, so some interesting things there. First, let's start with the official poverty line, how they count poverty. So you'll notice back in the 60s, remember with Johnson's War on Poverty, how do we actually measure who's poor? So taking the cost of food, timesing it by 3. And if you look, interesting graph, I put this on Canvas too. If you take that official poverty line to get a sense of what poverty looks like, you can find this interactive map here, right? So percent below the poverty line. So this is looking 2012. So a family of 4, anybody making less than $23,283, right? Individual under age 65, $11,945. So kind of an interesting map. We see some trends here, right? So the darker the blue, the more people below the poverty line, the lighter the less. But let's scroll into our region. So up here, right? So if we look at Reading, we have about 10 to 20% below the poverty line, and then our more rural areas around us, about 20 to 30% below the poverty line. But I wanted to, it's not letting me scroll over. Anyway, this is kind of an interesting map to check out and useful, right? Useful to get a sense of where are we seeing higher rates, concentrations of poverty. But as you noticed in the video, there's some problems with this measure, right? What's wrong with the official poverty line? She mentioned a couple of things. One, remember it's absolute. So if you make $1 more than the official number, then you're officially not considered poor. But of course, in the real world, you're poor. In fact, if we go back here, let's look at this. Right. So if you're a family of four making $25,000 a year, you're technically not considered poor, but in reality, $25,000 a year for a family of four is nothing, right? So there's that problem of the statistic being absolute. It's also, of course, out of date, as she mentioned, right? That the cost of food has not gone up as quickly as the cost of healthcare, housing, transportation, right? So it's not capturing what it actually costs to live today. She also mentioned that the official poverty line ignores non-cash income, right? So when we're seeing, somebody poor, it doesn't take into account food stamps, welfare, subsidies. And then, of course, the big one, at least for me, is that the official poverty line is for the entire country. It ignores the differences in the cost of living, right? So here's an interesting measure that it costs a lot more money to live in some states than others. So how much do you need to make in order to need to make an hour in order to afford a two-bedroom home in these states? So if you look at California, you'd need to make almost $27 an hour to afford a two-bedroom home, versus say, let's go Montana, you'd need to make almost $14 an hour to afford a two-bedroom home. So, right, when we think about measuring poverty, what poverty looks like in California is going to be really different than what poverty looks like in Montana. So, my point here is that when we think about how do we measure poverty, it's really important to recognize that our official statistics, there's some strengths but some serious weaknesses to them as well. Okay, so that's the end of part 2. There's one more part in this series. Make sure you watch that, part 3, Who Are the Poor?